Just 13 days after they moved in, their 3-year-old little girl was standing on a kitchen chair and laughing, describing murders that she couldn't possibly have known anything about inside of a house that everyone had thought was normal, but actually held this terrible secret beneath the kitchen floor, beneath the very chair that she was standing on. The family had had no idea that there was anything at all beneath that floor when they had brought their dining room furniture into the kitchen nearly 2 weeks earlier and set it up. This nightmare began in the summer of 1991 when the Clark family moved in. Jimmy had been an auto mechanic and Jenny a restaurant manager, and they had both been working very long hours and trying to raise 6 children in a 2-bedroom trailer. Well, now they had finally saved up enough money for something better, or so they thought. This unassuming farmhouse sat on 5 acres on the outskirts of a small, unincorporated Kentucky community. And strangely, for a house that hid such a horrible secret, it appeared absolutely normal, friendly even. It existed plainly, openly, pretending that it had nothing to hide. To the children, it felt enormous. 4 bedrooms, all upstairs, a wide living room spanning the entire front of the house, a barn, outbuildings, a towering tree out front that the kids immediately claimed as the best climbing tree that they had ever seen. Laura was 11 years old and entering the 6th grade. Mary was 10 and she followed close behind. Bobby was 6 and he hated that he was always left out. Then there was Brenda and Natalie, the twins, and lastly, there was Candy, just 3 years old. Yes, the one who would soon be recounting those murders in the kitchen.
I killed them.
On move-in day, the house was filled with motion. Jenny scrubbed the kitchen floor, while Jimmy hauled furniture in all by himself, refusing to hire movers. The house itself showed its age. It was built sometime in the 1920s, and it wore its history plainly. Wallpaper peeled, some floors sagged, but none of that mattered. The very first thing that Jimmy did was hang a porch swing. He reasoned that every house needs a swing, otherwise it's just not a home, right? There was one detail, however, that Jenny just could not ignore. Right in the center of the kitchen floor, there was this large red stain, deep and rich, and for some reason emotionally disturbing, and one that no matter how hard she scrubbed, it would not go away.
Welcome to Velarcana. Here we share mysteries that often defy explanation. I research the cases, my husband tells the stories, and if you like mysteries, you should subscribe.
Back when they had been considering the house, Jenny had asked about that big red stain in the middle of the kitchen floor, but the landlord just dismissed it. Tomato juice, probably from canning, or something else. Nothing that a little elbow grease won't remove. Well, Jenny scrubbed, and she scrubbed for nearly an hour, and when she finally stood back, she thought that the stain was gone. But later that afternoon, strangely, as the light shifted through the kitchen windows, it was clear that the stain hadn't gone anywhere. And oddly, it now looked darker, richer in color, somehow. Well, she pondered over it for just a minute, but then she went to clean something else. Later that afternoon, the family gathered together on the porch, taking a quick break, and as they were all sitting there, Lulu, their golden retriever, found something interesting. The family watched as she started clawing at the side of the house where the house meets the ground. Well, she dug down below the cinder blocks and she uncovered this rectangular window facing the area just below the kitchen floor. And curious, Jimmy grabbed her collar and pulled her back. Then he got down on his hands and knees and he cupped his hands to block the sun and he peered through the window. "It's a cellar," he said, "and it runs beneath the kitchen." Well, for some reason, and she didn't know why, Jenny instantly thought about that big red stain. Jimmy could see that there was this long table that dominated the space, and it looked as if it were fastened directly to the floor. Dusty shelves lined the walls, rusted nails and old cans scattered throughout the room. Well, after a second, the smell hit everyone. Jimmy first, then the rest of the family. It was foul, heavy, and unmistakably fleshy. Well, Jimmy said that it had to be connected to the septic system somehow, so he filled the dirt back in, and then everyone went back to work moving in. The kids eagerly unpacked their boxes and put their toys into their rooms. But this was only day one, and even before this day was over, something invisible would make its way through the house. The Clark family had worked all day long moving into their new home. Happy and exhausted, everyone was now in their own rooms, feeling a sense of accomplishment, when Laura heard someone walking out of the hall. And it didn't sound anything like her siblings. No, these were measured steps, like someone wearing heavy boots. Oddly, these footsteps would stop every so often. And to Laura, that sounded as if someone were pausing at each bedroom door as it passed, and then continuing on. When the steps reached her door, Laura called out, "Who's there?" But no one answered. Instead, she heard breathing, deep and uneven. It was a wet, wheezing type of a sound that kind of scrapes at the silence. Well, her stomach tightened, and thinking that maybe someone was trying to scare her, she peered through the narrow crack between the door and the frame. Out in the hall, she saw something blocking the light, but it was all wrong. Too tall, too wide. Its edges were thick and misshapen, nothing like her father's or her uncle's silhouette. Well, with her heart racing, Laura mustered up enough courage and she flung open the door. But the hallway was empty. I suppose that the first week or so living in an old house like that can probably play tricks on the mind, right? A creak becomes a footstep, a draft becomes someone breathing, and then a shadow becomes some weird shape. And that's what the family told themselves as strange things began to accumulate, like the family car running perfectly until it entered the driveway. Then it died. Every time. Footsteps echoed with no one there. Doors slammed shut all on their own. Shadows moved at the very edges of the rooms, and everyone in the family experienced these things. So after living there for only 6 days and not knowing what else to do, Jenny called the family's preacher, and he came out and blessed the house. But it didn't really do any good at all. Maybe it did worse, because the very next day, day 7, the family began to look sick. They had pale faces, sunken cheeks, dark circles around their eyes that made their eyes appear way too large for their skulls. Unnatural. Even their hair looked different, stringy, matted, as if no one had the energy to brush it properly. They looked like people who were slowly losing a fight. Well, that night was super hot, and Laura and Mary were in the bedroom with the windows open, when suddenly both windows just slammed shut at the same time. And it wasn't as if they had maybe lost their wedge and then had been pulled down by gravity. No, it was violent. So violent, in fact, that glass shattered and both girls screamed. Shards flew through the air and scattered across the floor. And for just a moment, neither girl moved. They just stared at each other in silence, a couple of shards of glass in their hair. Then finally, Mary got off the bed and headed toward the window. And Laura turned around and she was able to see into the blackness over Mary's shoulder. There was this slight breeze, and the night was overly dark. And then they saw it, a face. But only for a second, and then it was gone. There had been no footsteps outside, no sounds at all, actually, only blackness where this face had just been. Well, the next morning, day 8, the family was awakened by Lulu's barking. It seemed to come from everywhere, but she was nowhere around. The family searched, but they just couldn't find her. They looked all over the house, from top to bottom, closets, bedrooms, under beds, but there was no sign of her. and then for a bit, the barking stopped, so the family busied themselves with getting breakfast onto the table. And just as they were all about to sit down and eat, Lulu began barking again, frantically. Well, the family froze, and that's because the sound, the barking, was coming up through the floor. So Jimmy got down on his hands and knees, and he found this crack in the linoleum, and he pulled on it, and it peeled up, revealing a trapdoor beneath. Old wood, rough edges, the kind of thing that you don't ordinarily see in farmhouses. Well, unless the house was built to store something, or maybe hide something, I guess. When the trapdoor was opened, a burst of cold air rushed up from the darkness, and it was all wrong, as if somehow it carried secrets in the coldness. While a moment later, Lulu was rushing up the steps, and then she bounded into the kitchen. How did she get down there? It couldn't have been through that window glass on the outside. No, that was buried. So Jimmy climbed down into this strange room to look for another entrance. But he didn't find any. There were no tunnels, no holes in the wall, no door, nothing that could explain how a golden retriever could end up sealed beneath the kitchen. No, he climbed back up, and then he shut the trap door, and that was when Natalie screamed. The morning sun was streaming through the living room window, falling on this gold cross that hung over the couch, causing it to glow extremely bright, abnormally bright. Well, that, and the fact that it was upside down, is what had caused Natalie to scream. Well, keeping a saner mind, Jimmy all but dismissed this as a child's prank. Surely one of the kids must have done this. So he climbed onto the couch to fix it, muttering under his breath, half angry and half confused. But the moment that his fingers touched the metal, sparks snapped. Static electricity that was so powerful it was visible in the air. He jerked back, cursing, then he used the dish towel. He got the cross, but still he winced because the electricity shot through the towel into his hand. Then he turned and he looked at the homemade wooden cross that hung above the kitchen archway. And yes, that one too was upside down. But with that one, well, the archway was just way too high for any of the children to have done it. So he climbed down, moved over, and then he jiggled the wooden cross off of the nail, and it dropped into his hand, causing him to scream as soon as he touched it. Everyone watched as this red welt formed where he caught it. The children then all became quiet, as if they realized that something was happening, something that the adults didn't really want to say out loud. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't new house jitters. No, this was something that could hurt you. The event had been so intense, so bizarre, that the children all spent the rest of the morning outside. No one wanted to be under that roof. Of course, they couldn't stay out there all day, so one at a time, they all found their way back inside. Later that night, Laura prepared to take a bath. She turned on the water to fill the tub and then stepped away for just a second to grab her pajamas. But when she returned, the bathroom was filled with steam. It was thick and billowing, making it all but impossible for her to see more than a foot or two in front of her. Steam was rising off of the tub, like as if the water had been running for a long time. But it hadn't. The water barely filled the bottom of the tub. Well, she wiped the mirror and took a minute, letting the water continue to fill as she forced calmness back into her body. Old houses have personalities, right? They creak, they settle, they do weird things. But even while she was focusing on those thoughts, she couldn't really believe them, not with all of the things that had been happening this last week. Well, she undressed and then lowered herself into the bath. The water felt good. It was warm and calming at first. But then she felt it, that eerie, unmistakable feeling of being watched. Someone or something was in the bathroom with her. She tried to sing quietly and get her thoughts away from the feeling. But then something moved at the edge of her vision. It was dark and fluid and fast. Well, she froze. She kept her eyes forward, terrified to turn her head. She rinsed fast and then reached for the drain plug, desperate to end the bath. But to get out, well, that would mean she would have to turn her head and look at the door. As she whispered desperately, fearfully, "Daddy." Not really loud enough to carry. No, it was more like a hope. And then she forced herself to turn, and sure enough, a figure stood just feet away. Long hair, a long dress, hands that were delicate, so much so they were almost gentle. But where the face should have been, well, it was just a pale void. Not shadow, not darkness, no, absence. Well, Laura, of course, screamed, and the figure hissed. And then it quickly vanished. Well, a second later, Jimmy and Jenny rushed into the bathroom and they found Laura shaking, crying, and still wet, clutching that towel as if it were armor. Jimmy searched the house, checking closets and looking under beds, but there was nothing. This had become the pattern. Something terrifying happens, and then there's no proof to be found. But everyone had the same thought. Whatever was happening, well, it had something to do with that strange room below the kitchen. So Jimmy called his brother Brian, who was a general contractor. Maybe he could check out that room and make some sense of what was happening. Well, the very next morning, Brian showed up and he descended into that room. But what he found? Well, it was less like a basement and more like an operating room for the dead. By the ninth day, fear no longer appeared as sudden shocks. No, it had become part of the routine. It lived in the corners of rooms, in the pauses between footsteps, and in the way that everyone waited just a half a second longer before opening a door. In some quiet, instinctive way, every member of the Clark family understood that whatever was happening wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Well, Brian arrived early, and as a general contractor, he had worked in crawl spaces, basements, in condemned homes, and half-collapsed structures. He understood bad smells, rot, sewage leaks. He had seen houses in far worse condition than this one. So when Jimmy mentioned the cellar, Brian nodded, he grabbed his flashlight, and then he said he would have a look. When they opened the trap door, the first thing that Brian noticed, of course, was that smell. It was powerful, overwhelming, actually, and with every step that he took down into the cellar, it intensified. It was organic, heavy, and old. At the bottom, the cellar opened up into a room, roughly 10 by 20 feet. There was this long table that dominated the space. It was narrow, about 3 foot wide, but unusually long, at least 10 feet from end to end. And it wasn't simply resting on the floor. No, for some reason, it was bolted down. At one end of the table was this circular hole, and beneath it, set into the floor, was a rusted drain. It was stained orange with age and use. There was a large sink against one of the walls, and thick pipes ran overhead, disappearing into the ceiling. The room was cold, but it wasn't an ordinary cold. No, the chill felt invasive, as if it bypassed one's clothing and just settled directly against the skin. Well, Brian reached out and he touched the stone wall, but instantly he recoiled. It was so cold that it was hot, so he readjusted himself and then deliberately placed his open palm on the wall. Along with being extremely cold, it was rough, but there was something else. Something that just had to be his imagination. It was eerie. See, there was this pulsing, like a slow, rhythmic vibration, as if something behind that wall, and I know, this is going to sound absolutely crazy, but it was as if something behind that wall had a heartbeat. Well, he pulled his hand back quickly and then searched the rest of the room. He found no dead animals, no sewage leaks, no structural issues that could explain the smell or the sensation. So, after finding no answers, he climbed the steps and went back into the kitchen. He apologized to Jimmy, but he had absolutely no idea where that smell was coming from or what that room was about. Just the damnedest thing. Well, the rest of the day went pretty much like all of the others. A whisper here, a footstep there, and all the while, each family member was feeling more and more run down. Well, the next morning, day 10, just 3 days before their youngest daughter, Candy, would recite those horrible murders, Jimmy and Jenny woke up on the verge of a mental breakdown. In less than 2 weeks, this house had completely drained them of energy. Later that evening, Jimmy heard a sound coming from the kitchen. So he poked his head in and he saw the table had been moved, allowing the linoleum over the trapdoor to ripple, as if something from that room below was pushing upward, maybe wanting out. And then came a sound that froze him into place. Crying, deep, powerful sobs, like someone whose grief just had nowhere left to go. They rose up from that room below the kitchen, only lasted for a minute, and then complete silence, making Jimmy wonder if he really even heard them in the first place. Then, day 12, just one day before everything went crazy, the family ran out for errands. When they returned, it looked like someone had vandalized the house. What first looked like trash was all over the living room. And then they noticed the crosses. They were no longer on the walls. The gold cross lay on the floor, and it was snapped cleanly in two. Its chain was even twisted and bent, as if somebody had wrenched down on it with a lot of force. The homemade wooden cross was nearby, and it was split right through the grain. Above both of them, smeared across the wall, was this thick red substance that clung to the paint in uneven streaks. And then Jenny reached down and she picked up one of those pieces of trash. And when she did, she immediately realized that it was actually a page out of the family's Bible. And then she looked around at all of the other wadded up pieces of paper and she realized that someone had just completely ripped up the family Bible. Well, the police were called, and they searched the house thoroughly. The windows were intact. The doors showed no damage. Nothing was missing, and there was no sign of a forced entry. No explanation was given. Well, the next day, the last day, would change everything. By the 13th day, whatever fragile balance that the family had been clinging to finally collapsed. Morning broke without relief. Jenny went upstairs to wake Candy, who lashed out without warning. She scratched her mother's face pretty badly, and Jenny pulled back. Candy just looked at her with this crazy intensity that felt way too focused for a 3-year-old. And then, without any prodding from her mother, Candy got up and methodically got dressed and went downstairs. At the breakfast table, the atmosphere was unnervingly quiet. Candy sat perfectly still in her chair, with her hands folded in front of her in her lap, as her eyes moved slowly from face to face, as if she were studying each family member, like a criminal who is just about to commit a murder. Well, everyone shifted uncomfortably, holding their forks, kind of waiting for her to speak. And then she let out this full-bodied laugh. It was rich, and it was much deeper than her normal voice. And as she did, she took her finger and she scooped up a clump of jelly, and she smeared it all on her arm. And then she said, "I drank their blood." She repeated that, "I drank their blood," and listened to them scream. Well, everybody just sat in shock, completely confused. "Robert Meadows died," she said. And then she reached up for another glob of jelly, and I cut his throat with my knife, and I watched him bleed. And he bled for so long. And then there was Pearl Ann Miller. I stabbed her in the chest, and she screamed and died, and I drank her blood too. And then things got violent. She grabbed a fork and she stabbed her mother's hand. Well, Jenny cried in pain, and Candy just jumped up at that point, stood in her chair, and continued. On and on she went, retelling murderous stories and laughing. Eventually, Jimmy snapped out of his shock. He leaned in, and he said that enough was enough, and she better stop right then. To that, Candy, she started moaning in this odd voice and expression. She just shook her head slowly, and she continued. I killed Raymond Martin. I killed Randall Newman. I killed Polly Patrick. I killed them all. Their blood was so sweet. I loved the taste.
I drank their blood.
Well, that was enough. The other children got up and they ran for the table. And Candy clapped her hands in delight. You're all going to hell. You know that? You're all going to suffer. Those bastards, they tried to stop me, but I didn't take their crap. They messed with me, then I messed with them right back. Do you want me to mess with you too, Daddy? She stared into her father's eyes and held his gaze. Well, Jimmy told Jenny to get the kids. They were leaving. As the family hurriedly gathered whatever they could carry, Candy continued to say these crazy, vile things. And Jimmy, not knowing what else to do, threw a blanket around her and then quickly wrapped her up like a burrito. She thrashed violently, but he was able to contain her. Moments later, the family was in the truck, with Candy hissing and spitting on everyone. Well, they took her to the only place that they thought could help, the church. Then inside, the preacher led them in prayer. Candy fought against Jimmy's grip, continuing to thrash violently, her cries turning into something animalistic and feral. Then she screamed one final time and then finally collapsed. When she opened her eyes, whatever had been there before was gone, and Candy was back. She looked around, confused. Daddy, she said. Intense story, isn't it? Well, that was enough. They drove back to the house, and they stayed only long enough to get their things. They weren't going to stay another night in that house. They worked quietly, and by nightfall they were gone. The farmhouse stood empty again, its porch swing creaking gently in the breeze. The Clark family never returned. So, what kind of evil was in that house, right? Well, that's a question that Jimmy wanted answered as well. And after knocking on several doors, he got an answer. I guess if something like that were to happen to a man's family, some part of that man would want to know why, right? What caused it? I know I would. And the more Jimmy thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. So he stopped at neighboring farms. He knocked on doors. He asked questions. Most people just shrugged. Others said that they had heard stories, but couldn't really remember any details. And then he pulled into the yard of an elderly couple who were sitting on the porch, rocking gently in the afternoon heat. When Jimmy described the house, its size, that it sat on 5 acres, the barn out back, and the big tree in the front yard, the man didn't hesitate. Turner's, he said. Turner's funeral home. Funeral home? Well, Jimmy said that just couldn't be, because the landlord had told him that it had just been an old farmhouse for as far back as he could remember. But the man shook his head, and then he gave details. The wide living room, the long porch, the layout inside. The woman beside him nodded along, adding quietly that she herself had attended more than one funeral there when she was very young. It had closed years ago, she said, long before it turned into that farmhouse. Long enough, she thought, that most people had just kind of forgotten all about it. Well, Jimmy thanked them, got into his truck, and then drove in silence. Amy found this case in this book titled 2 Weeks, a true story of a family's haunting, by Rebecca Patrick Howard. And she reached out, and Rebecca agreed to come on our show and give us a brief statement about her involvement in this case. And it is interesting. And in exactly 1 minute and 57 seconds from right now, Amy is going to come on and share that interview. You know, I'm sure that for some people, the revelation that the house had once been a funeral home explains this case. But for me, it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't explain exactly what it was that was haunting the house. It doesn't explain why no one else that had ever lived there came forward sharing similar experiences. And it most certainly doesn't explain how a 3-year-old could have named dead people that she had never even heard of. For those of you who watch this show on a regular basis, you know me. I'm the skeptic. Amy is more the believer. And when I look at this case, I can't help but wonder if it might be explained in more rational terms. Stress, maybe. Illness. Reportedly, the family was looking ill just a few days after they moved in. Remember? So maybe it was environmental factors like mold or chemicals or carbon monoxide, conditions that can distort perception and amplify fear. But I guess, to be fair, even those explanations leave gaps, because I can't see how fear would make a 3-year-old act like that. You know, if this case really happened the way that it's been shared, and if cases like these are truly reported factually, meaning that they're not hoaxes, then whether what the Clarks experienced was something psychological, environmental, or even supernatural, I guess one thing is clear. The house changed that family. And I guess some places do that, right? And that's probably because if hauntings are indeed real, then they remind us just how thin the boundary might be between the living and what so many of us, myself probably included, desperately try so hard not to see.
Without getting into a bunch of details on what you did to investigate this, you, years afterward, got some additional information on that being a funeral home. Tell me about that.
Right. So it was almost 20 years later. My coworkers and I were at lunch talking about spooky things that had happened to us growing up. And it's not that I tuned out, but maybe listening with half an ear. But then she said there was an embalming table in the basement. And I kind of looked up. I was like, an embalming table? Yes, it used to be a funeral home. And I don't know why, but so, I mean, it clicked. And I'm like, where did you live? And she told me the name of the community. And then I described the house, and we realized it was the same house that my friend had also lived in. That was unnerving. And she did validate the fact that it did used to be a funeral home.
Go into just a small bit of detail, if you would, on how she validated that it used to be a funeral home.
They didn't live there very long either, but they also had questions about what had happened there and what might have led to these. She called them disturbances, what might have led to the disturbances. And they didn't go to the neighbors and ask. They just went straight to the courthouse and looked up the history of the house, who owned it, when it was built. And from there, they pointed them to the historical society, and it very much was a funeral home. But she was also curious, she and her family were like, what's going on here? Like, there has to be an explanation for this. Like, they believed that it was supernatural, but they wanted to know why it was supernatural. And that's when we knew for sure that, yes, it had been a funeral home.
Thank you so much for watching. We're thinking about throwing up some of our raw interview footage on our other channel, and comment below if you'd like us to do that. And if you enjoy mysteries, try one of the other videos on this page.